When Alaskans created the Permanent Fund, it was a grand experiment. Other oil provinces had tried to preserve some of their wealth for future generations. Few, if any, had succeeded.
Money, it's a gas. Grab that cash with both hands and make a stash.
9 years after statehood, the oil strike at Prudhoe Bay in 1968 ushered in a new era of prosperity for the 49th state. But while the state treasury received $900 million in lease bonuses the next year, the money was quickly spent, and Alaskans worried that more oil wealth would slip through their fingers. They became determined to cushion the boom and bust cycle that had plagued states and countries with natural resource wealth.
Share it, fair it, don't take a slice of my pie.
For several years, legislators and residents debated what to do with the pending windfall. Eventually, they settled on a long-term savings account, an idea first put into legislation by Governor Keith Miller in 1970. Voters in 1976 decided on a constitutional amendment to set aside 25% of royalty and lease income from the oil fields. Today, the question is whether fund income can be used for government. As budget reserves shrink, the day of reckoning approaches on the state fiscal gap, and policymakers are revisiting the circumstances surrounding the creation of the Permanent Fund. Perhaps no other part of state government has undergone as much scrutiny. The investment policies gradually have been liberalized over the years, growing the fund to $25 billion and beyond, exceeding the dreams of its founders. The Dividend program established in 1982 has given every resident a share of the oil wealth. But the Dividend also has made for complicated discussions about the state's tax structure and about the civic obligations of Alaskans.
Money, get back. I'm all right, Jack. Keep your hands off of my stack.
And as 2003 came to a close, there were competing proposals for constitutional amendments to change the structure of the fund or the dividend. If there's any consensus, it's that Alaska, due to the foresight of a generation of political leaders, has built itself an asset that is the envy of other states.
This is the richest generation of Alaska's history. This is the most spoiled generation of Alaska's history. And to try and maintain our lifestyle at the expense of our children and grandchildren is asinine. It is absolutely ridiculous to be thinking that we should be going after the small portion we're saving. This generation, and I've been a part of that, has spent 70 or 80 billion of today's dollars from the resource wealth of the North Slope. Those dollars are non-renewable resources. They're not going to be there 40 years from now when we have to educate kids in groups of 20, 30, or 40 on the banks of the Yukon or the Kuskokwim, and we don't have the resources.
We're the only state in the Union that has the obligation of ownership. And we're not communism, we're not socialism, we're not unbridled capitalism. We're an owner state. And I've said many times, oh, to be as rich as we were before Prudhoe Bay, when we were rich in spirit. Now we have $25 billion in the bank and we can't get across town. Now that's just a bunch of crap.
The Permanent Fund was a stroke of genius at the time. But, you know, last generation's stroke of genius is the next generation's conventional wisdom, and the generation after it's albatross around its neck. And that's what the Permanent Fund is.
Any fiscal plan you look at, anything, requires spending some permanent fund earnings. There is no way possible to long-term solve the state's fiscal gap without spending permanent fund earnings. There just isn't. Probably even a bigger problem than sales tax versus income tax versus motor fuel tax or alcohol tax or budget cuts. It's the permanent fund. It's a monster and we created it.
Governor Sheffield had the notion of a capital projects fund. He wanted to use a bunch of money and use it for capital projects. He wanted to use the money to pay for longevity bonuses and student loan programs. He wanted to endow those programs. Governor Cooper wanted to endow education. He wanted a portion of the earnings to be used to create an educational endowment which would pay for K through 12. That was a big proposal, but it did not meet with... See, the problem is every single proposal that's come along for use of fund income has not been able to compete effectively with the only one that really has passed, which is share the money equally, everybody gets the same amount.
I think the future is now. I remember back in the 70s, we were voting to determine that we would put money away for a rainy day. And we knew that if you had oil coming, it wouldn't come at that level forever. And we were looking for a way to provide for ourselves as our state grew and as our needs increased. And I think that the rainy day is here.
People knew there would be a rainy day, but nobody knew what it was going to look like or how we were going to agree to define it.
I guess the bottom line is it raining? Obviously, majority of people feel it is. I tend to be a little bit more optimistic. I think we still have a bright future, that we're too young to tap into our rainy day or our retirement account at this point.
And I believe what came out of it is a good plan. It produces a long-term balanced budget for Alaska if enacted. It does keep our healthy, pro-business economy and vital services. It grows and protects the savings account. It continues a sizable and growing dividend, and it calls for a vote of Alaskans.
Of course it's regressive. It has exactly the same effect as a flat tax. The permanent fund dividend is part of the economic base of the state of Alaska. It's one of the state's largest payrolls. It has the highest efficiency of anything the state does in terms of turnover in the economy. Taking it back is a regressive tax.
And there's no reason why a drop in oil prices, over which we have no control over, should it dictate the amount of education we give Alaska's children.
And the no vote means no, you can't have $800 million of the permanent fund earnings. No, you can't cut dividends by $500 a year. No, you can't shortfall the future principal of the permanent fund by cutting inflation proofing. No means no.
Why don't they make big oil corporations pay their fair share? Stand with Alaska conservation voters. Vote no.
Protects the dividends and protects essential services. So please vote yes.
They're out to raid your permanent fund dividend. Republican leaders in the legislature.
Adopt a sensible budget plan. Well, we got to tell them what to do.
They can use part of it, yeah, but don't take it all from us.
That makes it sound like you're getting some big payment. That's a crummy little payment.
I think they're going to do is just use it for their own raise.
So many people are planning to vote no for so many different reasons.
The voters sent the legislature a strong message about using the permanent fund to balance the state budget. If the message were sent any louder, the recipients would have to wear earplugs to keep from going deaf.
And ever since the inception of the permanent fund, there's always been some scheme to steal that money. And this is the first one that made it to the ballot.
There will be no tinkering with the permanent fund, as far as I'm concerned, or the dividends without a vote of the people. So together, we did accomplish something we've all tried to achieve, an unprecedented show of unity among Alaskans as they voted 80...
The Vote Yes campaign spent something in the neighborhood of $700,000 or $800,000, and the Vote No campaign didn't spend much but a tenth of that. And the $700,000 or $800,000 was successful in convincing only 1 in 6 people that they were right.
And I think that sent shockwaves through at least the halls in Juneau. I think that has, for good or for bad, I think that has set back the debate about what's going to happen long term.
The 99 vote, it was a poorly put together plan. It was poorly promoted. People who said they're for it then tried to backstab it. It was just, I don't put much credence at all in the 1999 vote, except it tells you that Alaskans, when asked, do you want to give up your free money, the answer is no.
Well, they were saying, we don't trust you. They were saying, you don't need the money.
The reasons are as multitudinous as the number of voters. Almost every person who voted had their own concept or idea why they voted. Some people voted no because it didn't have a tax element.
I think it's a mistake to say that people, that vote meant that people never want it to happen. All those legislators that voted in favor of the 1999 proposition got reelected. That was a startling piece of cognitive dissonance.
Chairman of the Special House Committee on the Alaska Permanent Fund, Clark Greening, and Senator Pat Rohde discussed the possible economic effects of this fund with noted economists Dr. Barbara Bergman and Dr. Donald Gordon.
I have an ideal, and of course the ideal is not possible. To a large degree, I would think the money from the fund, the capital and or the income, should probably be distributed directly to each Alaskan on a per capita basis.
I'd like to use a lot of it for capital improvements. I would like not to use it for operational funds. And I think one of the best ways of resolving the problem is to give everybody $23,000 and get rid of it.
It took hundreds, maybe millions of generations for that oil to be created and lay there. And it is not correct that one generation of Alaskans should come in and completely waste that resource and take it.
So I think both in a moral sense and quite probably in a legal sense, I don't think you could take the fund and just divvy it up.
What I'm proposing is that a $25,000 distribution dividend, final dividend, which would end the dividend program, be paid to every eligible Alaskan, which means you have to already be in the state now and be a resident of Alaska to qualify. It will not have a whole new influx of people coming in. But that dividend would be paid out, which is just over half of the fund, about $14 billion. I propose the remaining $12 billion in the fund be constitutionally protected, and that would leave about $900 million a year in revenues to balance our budget. I honestly believe, or I wouldn't have introduced this, that this is probably the only way in my mind that the public is going to be willing to accept any use of the permanent fund.
There's no good reason not to divide it up among the people along the lines that Jerry Mackey proposed years ago.
A group of Republican lawmakers are proposing to protect the permanent fund dividend by amending the Constitution. The idea follows another legislator's proposal to end the dividend program with a final $25,000 payment to residents.
Which is better for your family, having $30,000 per family member that you can use or invest or save or do with as you choose, or that the chance that the politicians will let you keep getting a dividend.
I think there were enough legislators who thought it was buying votes and it was offensive that they weren't going to go for it.
If that had been on the ballot, you think it would have passed?
A lot of us talked about that and we didn't want to answer it.
It fills the fiscal gap by the tune of approximately $650 to $700 million annually, this billion-dollar gap, and providing the stability, preserving the dividends, allowing them to grow, protecting the permanent fund.
Madam Clerk.
28 yeas, 11 nays.
We forget the Alaska House of Representatives in May of 2002 voted to spend permanent fund earnings, and they voted to approve an income tax. It was a cockamamie income tax where the more you made, the lower percentage, opposite of every other income tax in the world, but it was an income tax in permanent fund earnings. They knew the governor didn't support it, or didn't have the nerve to support it. They knew the Senate wouldn't even have a hearing on it, but they laid their neck on the line and they voted for it. I think it was a big event in Alaska.
I don't think that it's necessary to consider going into the permanent fund to address our spending habits. The state is simply spending more than it's generating in revenue.
So let's clarify it now, because there's been a lot of confusion over this.
Well, yeah, but I think the media has made their own confusion because for some reason or another, you don't want to believe what we're telling them. We're not going into the permanent fund. I am not in the process or in the position of taking definitive recommendation that we go in and reallocate the dividend. The answer is simply no.
I asked you if you thought you were going to need permanent fund income in your first term as governor, and you said, no, I hope not. I certainly don't think so. Oil prices are higher than were expected then. What's changed?
Well, it changes the realization that it's imprudent to take that budget reserve down below $1 billion. And I think the fact that we have been fortunate enough to recognize higher oil prices doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to stay.
Republican Representative Norman Rochberg is depending on Governor Murkowski's support to make legislative changes to the permanent fund. The House Rules Chairman has reintroduced a bill that would limit the amount of oil revenue poured into the fund, leaving more for state government. This is the third session Rochberg has proposed the change. If the bill passes, 25% of oil royalties would go into the fund rather than 50%. The Alaska Constitution requires at least 25% go into the fund.
It was a smart move. Should have been done before.
The dividend and the permanent fund in and of itself has been looked at as a sacred cow in the past, and I think that sacredness ought to be removed and just look at it as a cash cow for the state.
You're looking at it as a barbecue?
I'm looking at it as, a picnic.
From the valley of the shadow of the outlet.
That is $25 billion.
To the customized petwear boutique. From the trailer of the fry chef to the palace of the chic, the cash cow lurks. The cash cow lurks. The cash cow lurks.
Representative Eric Croft was unsuccessful with an amendment that attempted to guarantee payment of a permanent fund dividend this year. The amendment would have tapped budget reserves to compensate for any shortage of permanent fund earnings that would have frustrated the dividend formula in law. Croft said the legislature was at fault, himself included, for past transfers of earnings into the principal of the fund, where legislators can't access it.
The reduction in the dividend is the market's fault. But if there is no dividend, it will have been the legislature's fault, and we should not make that happen.
Does that mean that we go, every time there's bad market years coupled over, we go into the Constitutional Budget Reserve to pay a dividend? What if we don't have a Constitutional Budget Reserve? Do we dip into the general fund to pay a dividend? I don't think that's exactly what the framers of this intended.
The minority is pressing for enshrinement and memorialization of the dividend, which to me would be horrendous, the worst possible public policy. Because we ultimately have to start taxing people to pay the dividend.
You put things in constitutions when you don't trust the legislature to handle them. And I think giving a legislative body that much money without any particular check on it, political check, if you will, is structurally, constitutionally inappropriate.
Alaska's got a famous tradition for a transient population. The carpetbaggers and the boomers and the snowbirds and everything else that come through here. I mean, I've seen people come and go in the half century I've lived here. And for those people to come up here and decide that their short-term public interest in gathering a dividend and stuff it in their pocket and leaving the state should be the proper public policy I take exception with.
If you get yourself elected as a politician to come to Juneau, you don't do it because you think you should give money away. You do it because you think you can do some good down there. And the way you do good is to organize resources, that is money, to buy things that make sense from your perspective. Politicians in general don't like the dividend program. If there was a secret ballot any time during the life of the dividend, I'm sure it would have been eliminated.
It's sad, but the liberal is saying we need more money so I can be the executive director of a new social program. And the conservative is often saying we need more money so we can build a road, and the road is really to the property I'm trying to sell. I think either side's constituency, although different in terms of how they would spend the money, will support spending for their side of the political spectrum at the expense of the future.
Oddly enough, many of the Democrats seem more determined to protect the permanent fund and the dividend program than do the Republicans, despite the fact that the creation of the permanent fund was the most conservative things we could have ever done.
It's a transformation. I think the Republicans for years had projected themselves as the protector of the permanent fund, protector of the dividend. A lot of that came from Rick Halford. former Senate president, longtime Senate member who retired a couple years ago. The Democrats in these last couple years, I think, saw an issue. Democrats are tired of being in the minority. The Democrats have not controlled the Alaska Senate since 1978. And they're starting to feel like Cubs fans. They want to see something they can win on. So the Ds look around and say, gee, we can be the protectors of the dividend. We can be the protectors of the permanent fund. That's our issue now. We can win on that.
I do believe that the Republican Party has almost come out of the closet as anti-dividend and will soon come out of the closet as anti-fund, in my opinion, as well. This is the first year where we have failed to follow the inflation proofing.
Over the years, the Republican majority has done a considerable amount of overinflation proofing of the permanent fund. And I didn't hear anybody coming out and saying, oh, that's a terrible thing, we're putting too much money in there, too much money in the permanent fund because we're overinflation proofing it.
So I find it troubling that people don't have the respect or the faith of the great job the legislature has done in keeping their hands off of that money.
If the dividend program goes, it's inevitable, in my view, that the permanent fund will go after it. May take 10, 20 years, but it'll happen. I'll tell you why. Because no dividend now. It doesn't, people don't feel any pain at all if they draw something from the permanent fund. Dividends aren't affected. I could care less. They're faced with this. All right, now we need $1 billion. We can take it either from a permanent fund or impose $1 billion worth of income taxes on it. You know how they're going to vote, of course.
This sense that we are new and don't know who we are. It's nice to have a permanent fund, you know. We don't really have much permanent architecture. We don't really have very many permanent institutions. When I travel, I mean, England has pubs that have been around for 900 years, and we barely have 50-year-old buildings. I hope we can emphasize the permanence of the fund, and that my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, hopefully they're here, and hopefully having the same sort of bitter, impassioned discussions about how we spend the earnings.
If we handle it wrong, we'll be damned forevermore by future generations of Alaskans, in my view, and justifiably so.